10 years of horror, sacrifice, and enjoyment. Dead by Daylight has been around for quite some time, receiving countless patches, characters, perks, and reworks, but the community always seems to circle back to the same topics: stale metas, boring playstyles, playing with friends versus playing alone, and perhaps most importantly, what the game should be evolving towards. I personally have been playing DBD for 3 years before I decided to start my career in streaming it, and have witnessed the game expand and go through major changes as I played. In that time, I have become enamored with the game in that span, not because of a cool license or a love of horror, but for the gameplay that I could never experience the same anywhere else. That is why I made this video. Not to complain, not to say that everyone but me is wrong, but because I truly want the game to continue, and to do that at the best shape it's ever been, so that I can enjoy playing DBD at its truest potential. Some parts of it are great, others are decent, some need a bit more work, and I want to share the opinions I have. We'll be diving into a multitude of topics across DBD, from the experience for newer players to the meta. As a disclaimer, I am not a developer for Behavior or Dead by Daylight, and I am not a part of their creator program. I have no say on changes made to the game, and everything I present in this video is my personal opinion. You are free to disagree, and I encourage you to do so, as the more viewpoints we have, the better we can understand the game. My goal is simply to share my thoughts that I have had throughout my experience in the game. With that out of the way, let's dive in. One of the most important and powerful questions a game can have is the ideal vision for the game's future. Particularly in Dead by Daylight, this is a question that has consistently been brought to the fore, and a large chunk of it can be made into a very simple question. Is Dead by Daylight meant to be a competitive game or a casual one? Ask different players, and they'd likely give you different answers. That is the first topic of discussion in this video, which is that DBD seems to be trying to please both sides. Before we dive into the specifics, let's go more broad. What makes a game competitive, and what makes one casual? For a lot of games, there's no clear line between the two. Multiple larger games have ranked and unranked player queues, and some others are specifically designed for one side or the opposite, even if the other part of the player base is still playing it. However, Dead by Daylight does not clearly favor one category over the other, and while this can work for some games, I feel like this choice is actively hurting DBD as a whole. At first glance, it can seem like a party game. You can make lobbies with your friends and play together while witnessing some of the greatest horror icons hunt all of you down. But when you take a closer look, it becomes harder to tell. Many players don't consider you to have truly played the game until you reach 1,000 hours in it or more, due to its many different mechanics and rather steep learning curve, and playing on the killer side means losing the ability to play with your friends, unless if you play custom matches or wait for certain events. There are even professional teams who play the game in tournaments. DBD tries to cater to both categories of people in its balancing of the game, but why is this important? The main problem that occurs is that balancing for casual players and professional players often do not coexist well. For a casual player, they often prefer memorable and fun moments that don't feel repetitive, while professionals prioritize consistency and fairness. If a developer buffs a certain mechanic to make it stand out more and help casual players to have more fun, competitive settings might start abusing the new mechanic and complain about how it skews the game's balance. The same also applies in reverse, where nerfing certain things may satisfy the competitive player base, but make the game less interesting to a casual player. If I were to distill the dichotomy between these two settings, it would be that one side prefers novelty, and the other prefers tests of skill. A casual player will stop playing a game they believe has nothing new to offer, and doesn't usually dedicate too much time into learning the game at a deeper level. And a competitive player might repeatedly experience the same things, but enjoy it for being able to hone their skill against opponents. Of course, this is not to say that casual players don't care about skillful interaction, or that competitive players don't enjoy new and exciting things, but I believe that to an extent or another, this is their mindset. The reason that I tie all of this back into Dead by Daylight is because it feels like the devs are trying to balance for both sides, and doing that is very hard and can often fail, which can be risking the fact that they will all leave. While the game does not have to choose half of its players to keep and the other to discard, they do have to make a firm choice on which side the balancing will lie on. Without this choice, every patch can be fixing a problem the community has and creating a new one. Now that we've talked about two kinds of players, let's focus in on one of them. A newer player to Dead by Daylight can experience quite a few things when they first boot up the game. They see the cool visuals, they see all of these famous horror characters from across franchises in the same place, they play the tutorial to learn the basics, and finally start playing in public matches and having fun with the game. Then, of course, they might as well be a full-fledged player, tossed without care into a place with mechanics they've never seen or heard of, have no clue how to play against or as, along with 4 other people that expect them to already know these things, and who can get frustrated at having someone who they think simply ruins their experience. Sounds like fun, don't you agree? Of course, while this isn't the case for every new player, I can certainly say that this was my experience with the game, and I think it would apply to a decent number of other players as well. To put it simply, newer players can have their work cut out for them, even to just start playing the game at a beginner level and having fun. And of course, something that could also be said is these new survivors' inability to have access to most content in the game, with it being locked behind paywalls or long grinding for a game they have already paid for. But that is not something I can talk about, as that is behavior's prerogative to set, so we shall focus on the other things. If you introduced a new player to DBD without any of the visual aspects, you would be showing them a game where there are 300 plus perks, up to 20 of which can be in a trial, each majorly impacting a portion of the game, along with over 40 different killers that each have their own unique powers that interact in different ways, a charge system for progression that makes modifiers behave unexpectedly, and more. If the game were presented this way, it would probably have quite a few less people playing it than there are now, and it would scare off any casual player that doesn't want to learn all of it. But these new players don't know about this, and they've already bought the game, so they might as well hunker down and enjoy the experience they paid for. If I were to boil this down, its essence would be that Dead by Daylight has a grueling learning curve, which can easily alienate newer players. But for the game to stay alive, it needs those newer players to keep playing, so how do we improve on their initial impressions? I mainly have 3 ideas to share. Firstly, the tutorial. As I mentioned earlier, this game has quite a few mechanics to unbox at first and all other glances. The tutorial teaches you the absolute basics, using Trapper as an example. As a survivor, you run away or hide from the killer, finish generators, and escape. And as a killer, you utilize your power, kill the survivors, and try to prevent them from escaping. After that, you can play a practice match as either side with easier AI players to get a grasp for how to play both. While this is great, it rather misses the point of all of the other mechanics. Why did the killer move super fast, make me unable to heal, or block that window? And what's this totem thing? Why did that survivor stay alive after I hit them? Why aren't they leaving scratch marks? What does this prompt on my screen mean? An expansion to the topics the tutorials cover, without going too far, would largely eliminate most of these questions and allow for a much more seamless experience. Another idea I've had is to include mini matches or videos that explain perks, powers, and other more niche things that don't exactly need to be included in the tutorial. Even though Behavior has done their best with the patch that made the wording on perks easier to understand, some things are better understood with a demonstration. For example, Unbreakable lets a survivor recover 35% faster. Even if the player doesn't know about Dead by Daylight's charge system and can guesstimate an answer, it takes witnessing it to understand what that extra speed translates to in-game. This same reason is also why people have difficulty in making custom perks and killer power concepts, as they have no real counterpart to see how it would work. Even if this could be implemented into the in-game guide, with perhaps some hints to lead players towards it, it could have massive potential. Finally, one last feature that could be a great step in the right direction ties into our next topic of discussion: playing alone versus playing with friends. As players start to learn the many mechanics of the game and getting a firmer grip on their playstyles, they tend to start noticing certain patterns among their fellow players. Some of them seem to never quite know what's happening and have trouble with their teamwork, while others know what's going to happen ages before it actually does and have such good teamwork that they can't help but stare. What is the difference between these two? More often than not, it is because the former players are going into lobbies without a party of friends, and the latter players are. Of course, as killer, you play by yourself, unless if you happen to be playing certain limited game modes, so this applies less to them. The reason why this topic is of such vital importance to Dead by Daylight is because one side usually has a gameplay advantage, and a significant one. If you are the kind of person to talk with the friends you play with during the game, you likely already know this, even if you haven't yet realized the difference. Someone who can talk to another in a swift, survive with friends, has a lot more information available to them by the pure fact they communicate. If you or your friends see a piece of information, you can share it with the other player. Suddenly, you both know where the killer is more, where a hex totem is that the other couldn't get to, whether or not the other person is going for an unhook, and so much more. If Dead by Daylight is going to be balanced, there can't be such a wild swing in how strong one role is, purely from the fact that they have friends or other people to play with. If you balance around solo queue, Swifts can take advantage of that balance to make their team stronger than it should be. If you balance around Swifts, solo queue starts to feel like they can't keep up with the game anymore. Therefore, a good compromise is to try to even the playing field between the two factions, and then balance Survivor as a whole. Of course, both sides will likely never be equal, even if the game undergoes drastic changes, but closing the gap as much as possible is essential. To start with, the feature I said I'd mention earlier that you probably already forgot about, which is the ability to see other survivors' loadouts in the lobby. To be clear, this is technically already a feature implemented into DBD, but that implementation only allows you to view these in the middle of a match, which has an entire host of problems with it. If you can see the perks, items, and offerings your teammates bring, you can strategize around them and remember them when key gameplay moments come up. This is something that Swifts already have access to, as they can simply tell their friends what perks they brought, their game plan, and more, which means that if this were to be implemented, Swifts couldn't abuse it, while solo queue would rise to a level a lot more equal with Swifts. Other additions I think could be made would be more progress icons in the HUD. Is the survivor cleansing a dole or a hex totem? Or are they unhooking another survivor? Etc. Keybinds to state intent. I'm going for an unhook. I'll finish this gen. I'll cleanse or bless that totem. I'll distract the killer. And more emotes than simply follow me and over there. Each of these could all make their own impact on the game, and I believe it would be very positive overall, while still being something that Swifts can't manipulate advantageously. For our next topic, I had considered for a long time on what to say about it. I certainly have opinions, but the big problem is that map design is a very large and complicated subject, encompassing areas such as tile generation, palette, window, and totem spawns, the height of certain obstacles, and much more. With so many things to cover, articulating an opinion can be difficult. This is only compromised by the fact that I would need data in order to do so, which only behavior and those they give access to, if anyone, can utilize. A misinformed opinion can be even more harmful than no opinion at all, especially when you have a lot of people that pay attention to it. Therefore, if I can't give you a proper opinion, I would rather stay silent on the topic. We all know it, and we've probably all been there. You likely can't even count on your hands anymore the amount of times you've seen the killer tunnel or camp, or how often you've been gen rushed to the point even 10 generators isn't enough. While the specifics of each of these may vary, there's an underlying point that they all share. You know of them. Honestly, you should know about all of them, especially if you play both roles, because they are simply that prevalent. In Dead by Daylight, having a playstyle used more and more often is a bad thing for the players and the devs. It makes trials more repetitive, which means players get more and more bored of playing against it and potentially leave. In most cases, the playstyle is being used more because it is strong, although there are notable exceptions, such as Steagles, which means that something in the game isn't balanced and therefore needs to be fixed. Before I give my suggestions, let me preface once again with the fact that I do not have any influence on the game, and I realize that many other creators, players, and even the devs themselves have proposed numerous solutions for these problems. I simply want to give my opinions on the matter, even on such a contentious and sore spot for the community. Before I talk about any specific ideas, however, let's sidetrack to the more general topic of the theory behind shifting these playstyles. Besides restricting the freedom of the player, there are two main options for every change: punishing the player for using the playstyle, and rewarding the player for using alternate playstyles. While each of these approaches can work, I'd like to primarily focus on the latter. A reward is often more tantalizing to a player than a punishment, and elicits less pushback, as they see it as a bonus to switching playstyles, rather than a nerf they must power through to continue using the old one. Either tactic produces the same general result of nerfing the overbearing side comparatively, but the outlook changes depending on how it is implemented. To start off, we have tunneling, which can be argued to be the most prevalent of these playstyles. Tunneling is when the killer focuses down one survivor as fast as they possibly can, in order to reduce the remaining number of survivors, which is a massively advantageous position as a killer, as there are far less people that can heal, do gens, class totems, and more. However, this playstyle is often disliked, as it means the tunneled survivor has little to no gameplay during the match, and can't achieve much, leading to frustration. Depending on how the tunneling occurs, there can be a good chance that the survivor is unable to do anything after they have been unhooked, whether from a fellow survivor or anti-camp. So how do we encourage the spreading of hooks so that survivors can enjoy their full match and killers don't feel pressured to tunnel to win? The main reason why tunneling occurs is efficiency, or in other words, more survivors are able to get more stuff done in a shorter time span. So if we want to discourage tunneling, we want to incentivize spreading hooks by reducing survivor efficiency when you do. This could come in the form of a miniature pain resonance that doesn't cause screaming, or a nerf to action speeds of survivors, whether temporary or permanent, in order to ensure hooks are actually being spread, while leaving room for chances such as only being able to find one survivor. These rewards should only activate under a certain rule set. As an example, it only activates if the survivor you hooked was not the last one you hooked, with a grace period of 1 hook for happenstance. If the grace period is exceeded, the killer must now obtain 2 more hooks on separate survivors to regain the benefit. Through this, tunneling has technically not become any weaker. However, spreading hooks now becomes much stronger, which makes tunneling weaker in comparison, leading to more diverse playstyles. Next is camping, which is an odd subject, because in order to tunnel, you usually have to camp the survivor, but you can camp survivors without tunneling them. Put simply, camping is when the killer remains ready to come back to a certain survivor or location at any time, but the problematic part is usually camping survivors. Camping is normally done in one of 2 intensities, proxy or normal. Simply camping is staying within a small radius of the survivor so that other survivors are unable to help them. Proxy camping is similar, but is when the killer does it from a larger distance, usually with the help of their power. This shares a problem with tunneling, in that it causes the survivor to have less actual gameplay. Ignoring camping to tunnel, camping is usually done whenever the killer feels like if they play otherwise, they will be disadvantaged. Camping a slug, for instance, is done because if the killer leaves the slugged person, another survivor will come to pick them up. However, if they pick up the slug to hook them, they may be apprehensive of becoming blinded, turning their slug into a new chase that they lose out on. While this is a much more complicated subject than tunneling, I believe that a solution could exist nonetheless. I feel that the toxic part of camping is when the killer is camping with no true reason to, which usually means other survivors not being nearby. If the killer camps a slugged person because there are survivors nearby that could cause trouble, then the camping should be justified. However, with no other survivors around, camping shouldn't be common. While not as great as my idea for tunneling, I believe a decent place to start would be giving the killer undiminishing haste if they do not camp, which has a timed window to activate starting after a down or hook. While other survivors are nearby, this timer slows or pauses entirely, and resumes normal progression after no more survivors are within range. With this, the killer gets a meaningful reward for not camping a survivor, while not being robbed of such a reward due to survivor interference. Now we move on to the survivor portion of playstyles, which contains gen rushing. As the name implies, gen rushing is when the survivors complete the generators as quickly as possible, oftentimes at such a quick pace that the killer is unable to keep up. The faster the generators are done, the less time the killer has to kill everyone, and therefore the less pressure they have, and the more survivors escape. I believe the main problem with this playstyle is not in survivors doing the generators, as that is their main objective, but rather in how they stack items, add-ons, and perks to inflate their speed to enormous levels. So when survivors bring a variety of perks and items that don't necessarily synergize with each other, particularly for generator repairs, they should receive fitting benefits. As for what these benefits would be, I can't think of any ideas, but if you people do, feel free to let me know. As of whenever this video was recorded, Dead by Daylight has 324 perks, 176 for Survivor, and 148 for Killer. Out of these, only 4 perks can be run by each player. However, even on Survivor, which can bring a total of 16 perks combined into a trial, you often see the exact same 10 to 15, copy-paste, repeated match, after match, after match. This is what is called a meta, or a group of things that most people in the game use. Again, usually because they are the strongest. As I just mentioned, you can often see the same perks quite a lot, and over time, these perks haven't really changed, leading to the meta becoming stagnant. But if we have so many perks, not having the meta change is very concerning, as a healthy game will usually have a constantly evolving and shifting meta. For example, if aura reading perks became very popular, a new survivor meta could arise of blocking aura reading. After blocking aura reading became meta, Killer could run perks that don't rely on auras, creating yet another meta. This cycle should continually repeat, keeping players constantly strategizing as well as always seeing new perks, even if some of them aren't as common. However, in today's state of DBD, survivors usually only run looping perks, as they distract the killer for longer, allowing for more time for others to work on generators. On the killer side, although it is more varied, perks that slow how fast generators are done are the most common, and because the only real way to counter the gens being slower is to buy even more time, looping perks became even more popular, and the meta never really changed. If we have a stagnant meta, then players repeat the same perks, and if players repeat the same perks, players begin to get bored with the game. But what can we do to prevent the meta from going stale? We do so by balancing and reworking perks until all of a sudden there can be a debate over whether Decisive Strike or Visual are worse perks to bring because of newly balanced perks suddenly being used more. The more balancing there is, the closer we get to that ideal. However, as diverse as the community is, balancing also has levels of nuance to be explored. One of the most common examples of this nuanced balancing is in Dead Hard, a perk available on David King. What this perk does is that after you've been unhooked, if you are injured, free of exhausted and deep wound, and running, you can get a short burst of endurance, allowing you to take another hit without going down, instead going to deep wound. If, for a moment, we could ignore its activation conditions, which can be easily fulfilled in most cases, Dead Hard is an amazingly strong perk. Being able to take a hit in additional time can massively extend chases, wasting that much more time for the killer. However, despite its strength, this perk still falls behind in usage compared to perks like Lithe, Resilience, Deja Vu, and Windows of Opportunity. Why is this? It's because Dead Hard also combines a critical element in its design, and that is skill. It only gives the survivor endurance for half a second, which, while longer than it sounds, is still a very short duration. Killers can also counterplay against it by waiting to swing for a moment when they are in range of a survivor, causing them to potentially use their Dead Hard and not get the value from it. These skill interactions extend to the killer's side as well, with perks like Merciless Storm. Being able to block a gen that is almost completed, and for quite a long duration, could be said to be even better than a perk like Deadlock, which only blocks the next most progressed gen in the trial if they aren't all completed. However, Merciless Storm relies on skill checks to give this effect, meaning that some survivors can manage to hit every one of them and stop the effect from happening entirely, making it never activate. While these perks technically have very strong effects, because of their requirement of skill to use them effectively, they are more balanced than they would first appear. While I am personally not a fan of inconsistent perks, this is an entire philosophy of perks that I think has been underutilized and could be a basis for some future perks. Just as much as perks, though, so can the same apply to killers. If you were to ask most DBD players about what they thought the strongest killer was, there would be an overwhelming consensus agreeing on Nurse. She is able to ignore almost every form of counterplay that survivors normally have against a killer, is able to traverse long and short distances with ease, and at higher levels of skill can feel like the survivor's loss is inevitable. But Nurse has a few interesting facts about her, foremost being that she is one of the earliest killers to come into the game, and has retained her position of strongest all the way to today. The reason behind why Nurse has not been touched much is skill. While she is the strongest killer almost indisputably, Nurse requires just as much time to learn and master to access that power. A player has to memorize how long of a charge means how long of a blink, how to accurately track survivors' pathing, how to quickly judge where a survivor is after their blink, and if any of it goes wrong, they suffer from fatigue without having an injury on the survivor. While the balancing of killers is a very interesting topic, it would also be enough for a video on its own, so we shall discuss it another time. When going about the balancing of a game, there are two main mindsets that can be applied, being buffing and nerfing. Buffing is making something stronger, and as a counterpoint, nerfing makes something weaker. A game needs both to ensure that gameplay doesn't begin to become radically different, and leaning too far into one or the other can have disastrous consequences. As an example, let's imagine if the developers decided to make everything in the game twice as fast as it was before. Doubled move speed, action speed, etc. Some people say that in this situation, because everything has been doubled and not just a portion of everything, the game remains the same. But I would beg to differ, and for a very important reason. If the game doubles in speed, the players themselves do not. The person behind the character still thinks and reacts as the same speed as before, making precise things harder and making every mistake more punishing, which can especially create more stress for players, particularly on the killer side, where you have to bear all of the responsibility instead of sharing it amongst 3 other teammates. The goal for Dead by Daylight doesn't necessarily need to be making everything exactly as strong or as weak as everything else, however. This kind of goal is usually impossible to achieve with such a large amount of players and is a very big goal to strive for. Instead, the goal should be to make everything in the game each have its own meaningful place. I should be able to decide if I want to bring apocalyptic ingenuity into a match without worrying that I will be much worse overall because I took up a slot that could be used for Sprint Burst or Deliverance, simply because no matter how I would play, they are the better perk. These are some of my less important ideas for the game that aren't large enough for their own section, but deserve to be mentioned regardless. All of them, in no particular order. Maps are a major part of Dead by Daylight, and certain maps are better or worse for one side or the other. However, it can feel really bad after the color customization features have dropped to load into a realm like Ormond with light blue scratch marks, or perhaps Trickster's Delusion with almost any color of auras. I would like to see options that could allow us to set the color options they have given us on a per map basis, even if only for some of the more problematically colored maps, along with a wider range of colors that can be used, such as a color close to black. Please let me play Trickster's Solution normally. I beg of you, that map gives a permanent blindness effect for both sides. After having a rough match, perhaps being tunneled out, or simply making too many mistakes, survivors often die before the trial ends. Especially if there is a long ways to go for the match to end, many people, including myself, simply choose to leave. This now creates an odd situation, where the survivor no longer knows how their actions have impacted the rest of the match. I would propose adding a system that would allow players to view the results of their past few matches to combat this. Not everything that the end of match screen shows needs to be there, but even just knowing that your sacrifice let everyone else escape would help the mindset of many players, and learning instead that no one escaped I don't think would actually be that detrimental to the player's state of mind, as once they leave, they seem to already assume that everyone else is dead. This could also tie into having a list of every player from those matches you played, which could allow you to report or commend a person you forgot to, send friend requests, and more. This idea actually doesn't come from me, but from one of our community members, Caden Silvermoon, with some modifications, and if I could have anything from this section actually implemented into the game, it would be this. The core concept is that add-ons are no longer consumable, but rather have a fixed cooldown after being used, perhaps around 2 to 3 matches worth, with the cooldown potentially being higher or lower depending on how strong its effect is. In order to satisfy players who only ever want to run some add-ons, they can spend blood points to reset the cooldown, giving them the same reason to grind, and with more availability to get their specific add-on besides hoping it appears in the blood web. This could also introduce the add-ons having to be unlocked for killers through the blood web, perhaps with rarities first being available in ascending order up to the killer's first prestige. If you are wondering why I would push this idea so strongly, it is because I never run items, add-ons, or offerings other than the ones that give blood points unless if I need to do so for content. This is because I can't stand the thought of having one less of an item that I could eventually run out of semi-permanently, and implementing the system would allow my state of mind to run add-ons and all of the rest in peace. This one is fairly simple. While in the lobby, killer can see the items that survivors bring into the trials. Some of the models can be rather small, however, especially considering that the killer views the survivors from a distance, which can make it hard to tell what items the survivors are bringing. If the models for items could be slightly larger for killers, or perhaps a quick UI that shows their items, it could be very helpful. To end off, I believe Dead by Daylight will be at its best potential when players are given the opportunity to make meaningful choices all over the game's mechanics, and can have the information they need about the game more accessible within the game. The game only stands to benefit as it strives to come closer and closer to this ideal, and I've given you guys my opinion on how I feel this could be achievable. Thank you all for watching this. I truly appreciate everyone, everything, and most importantly, Dead by Daylight itself that led me here to where I am now, and I only plan on going further. This has been Void of Death, the Lich Unbound, reaching out from the endless abyss, and I look forward to your application to Unlife Corp.